What if I told you some spirits never left their graves, and tonight they might be watching you? If you love ghost stories, hit subscribe, tap like, and share this video so we can bring you even more terrifying tales. Subscribe, like, share to keep the ghosts coming.
New York City never truly goes dark. Even in the dead of night, when the pulse of traffic thins to a whisper and the endless procession of hurried feet slows into silence, the city breathes in neon, steel, and restless electricity. Yet at the heart of Lower Manhattan stands a place older than the towers of glass and chrome, older than the financial district's pulse, older even than the United States itself. St. Paul's Chapel. It stands like a relic of another time, its Georgian steeple rising against the skyline as though mocking the passage of centuries. Built in 1766, the chapel is a paradox, small, understated, and yet invincible. Through revolution, fire, epidemics, and catastrophe, it has endured, its walls neither bowed by flame nor shattered by fury. It is called the Miracle Church for having survived disasters that reduced surrounding buildings to rubble, most notably during the Inferno of 1776 and the cataclysm of September 11, 2001. But those who have lingered long within its precincts whisper another truth. St. Paul's survives not by miracle alone, but by guardians, not of flesh and blood, but of something far older, something eternal. The graveyard that enfolds the chapel is no mere resting place. Its headstones tilt like crooked teeth, weather worn and cracked, their inscriptions fading into indecipherable symbols, skulls with wings, cherubs with hollow eyes, cryptic epitaphs etched by hands now dust. Beneath this earth lie merchants and patriots, infants and elders, known names and forgotten souls. Yet those who wander among the stones swear the air thickens at dusk, that the silence here has weight, that unseen eyes watch from the periphery. For generations, visitors and caretakers alike have spoken of strange happenings within and around St. Paul's. Cold currents of air spiraling through sealed rooms, bells chiming though no rope is pulled, footsteps pacing the balcony when the chapel is empty, shadows that lengthen and twist, not in rhythm with the light, but in defiance of it. Most unnerving are the voices, soft, melodic, mournful hymns echoing through the nave, long after the organ has grown. Still. These are not stories of imagination alone. St. Paul's, as those attuned to the unseen will tell you, is not merely a place of worship. It is a threshold, a liminal space where the veil thins, where the past presses against the present like a breath on glass. And thresholds are never silent. To enter St. Paul's is to step into layered time. Here, George Washington once knelt in prayer after his inauguration. His presence still felt as though the wood of his pew retains his essence. Here, exhausted firemen slept on pew cushions during the smoldering nights after 9/11s, whispering of phantom hands that comforted them in their grief. Here, children have tugged at their teachers' sleeves and asked about the woman in the long dress who vanishes the moment one turns to look. This is the introduction most tourists never hear, for brochures speak only of heritage and history. But the true story of St. Paul's Chapel lies not in dates and architecture. It lies in the whispers of the graveyard, the phantoms of the nave, and the sense that this church has never once slept. It has remained awake, ever watchful, for over 2 centuries, and perhaps it is not the building itself that refuses to close its eyes, but the souls bound to it. In the stillness of night, when the last of the city's clamor dies, St. Paul's takes on another life. The chapel seems to breathe, its timbers groaning, its glass sighing, its walls murmuring. The air grows heavy, charged, as though invisible hands pass along the pews. A faint scent of candle wax lingers where no flame burns. Mirrors ripple with images that are not reflections. And always, there is the sense of presence and invisible congregation that gathers when the living depart. To expand the backdrop of this haunting, one must look not only at the chapel but at the centuries of energy it has absorbed. Every prayer uttered here, every tear shed, every corpse lowered into the soil has left an imprint. The American Revolution charged it with fervor, fire, and blood. Epidemics layered it with grief and the keening of mothers who buried children too soon. The Great Fire of 1776 left it encircled by ash, an island of survival in a sea of ruin, and September 11th imprinted it with both terror and miraculous protection. Each trauma is a scar, each survival is a vow. The chapel has become a vessel of memory so dense it leaks into the air, into the senses, into the realm of the paranormal. To stand within St. Paul's is to feel watched, not with hostility but with scrutiny. It is as though the dead lean forward to see you, to measure your soul, to weigh your intentions. You are no longer merely a visitor, you are an intruder in a realm where time and mortality blend. As the narrative unfolds, this story will not be told as a list of hauntings, nor as folklore detached from flesh. It will be told as an immersion, as though you yourself walked the corridors, touched the gravestones, breathed the heavy night air. The haunting of St. Paul's is not simply a collection of ghost stories. It is an atmosphere, a continuum, a rhythm that pulls the living into communion with the dead. The introduction is merely the threshold. Ahead lie deeper chambers, where the supernatural does not merely linger but intrudes, where the restless stir not as echoes but as actors, where the chapel becomes not only a sanctuary but a stage for the unquiet dead. And so part 1 closes as a door begins to open. For the city that never sleeps contains within it a church that refuses to dream, and in that refusal, something eternal has been born, something that watches, something that remembers, something that breathes in shadow.
Night in New York is never truly silent, but around St. Paul's Chapel, the city seems to hush itself. The roar of traffic grows muffled, the laughter of late drinkers fades, and the neon glare of nearby towers seems to dim. As though unwilling to trespass upon the chapel's domain, the air changes here. It is subtler than smoke, heavier than fogan, invisible pressure that sits upon the chest. Some call it reverence, others call it dread, but those who are sensitive, those attuned to the invisible fabric of the world, know it for what it is, the stirrings of spirits. The haunting of St. Paul's does not reveal itself at once. Like a careful predator, it circles first, a flicker at the edge of sight, a draft where no window stands open, the faint vibration of floorboards beneath feet that do not exist. But as minutes turn to hours, and as twilight gives way to the depths of night, the chapel comes alive. The living may think themselves alone, but the dead stir restlessly, as though answering a call only they can hear. Caretakers have long whispered of the first sign. The bells. St. Paul's bell tower, centuries old, has been known to stir when the streets outside lie empty, not in the bold clang of alarm, but in the gentlest of chimes notes that sound like fragments of forgotten hymns. They come not with the pull of rope or the touch of hand, but as if the very air trembles with memory. To hear them is to feel the hair rise at the back of the neck, for the sound is not crisp like metal against metal, it is soft, faded, as though the bells themselves are remembering how they once rang. Inside the chapel, the hauntings are more intimate. The pews creak with the weight of bodies unseen. Shadows move in patterns that defy logic, sliding across the floor against the current of light. Candles, left unlit for decades, are said to flicker in corners where no draught stirs. Mirrors distort their reflections, elongating faces or showing figures that do not belong to the viewer. A great many visitors leave, convinced they have seen nothing, felt nothing, heard nothing. But for those who stay longer, those who linger after midnight, the experience deepens. The church reveals its insomnia. The graveyard breathes with its own secrets. Here lies the girl child, the most frequently reported ghost of St. Paul's, dressed in colonial garb. Her form is seen most often at dusk, weaving between headstones with a skipping gait. Her laughter, high and musical, has been reported by dozens of witnesses, though it vanishes the moment one turns. Some describe her face as blurred, others as heartbreakingly clear, her wide eyes reflecting a world that ended too soon. No record tells her story with certainty. Was she claimed by the Great Fire, by smallpox, by hunger? Yet her spirit lingers, bound not by rage but by longing. The innocence of her presence unsettles more deeply than terror might, for it is a reminder that even children are not freed from haunting. But the child is not alone. Men in tricorn hats, their coats frayed with the cut of another century, have been glimpsed pacing the yard. A woman in mourning black, her veil concealing her features, is said to linger near the northern gate, swaying as if keening to a rhythm unheard. At times, passers-by swear they hear entire conversations whispered from the gravestones, fragments of prayer, sighs of lament, even the clash of argument. The earth itself seems restless, shifting beneath the weight of centuries. Inside, the chapel grows heavier still. Washington's pew, preserved as a relic of national pride, has long been the focal point of spectral energy. Tourists sometimes claim to see a figure kneeling there, head bowed, shoulders rigid, hands clasped in eternal prayer. His features blur in candlelight, but his outline is unmistakable, the figure of a man burdened with destiny. Skeptics dismiss it as imagination, but those who have stood close speak of an electric charge in the air, a vibration that hums through the wood. Whether Washington himself lingers or whether the pew retains an echo of his presence, the effect is undeniable. The seat of a nation's first leader has become a beacon. For the restless dead, more disturbing are the accounts from the aftermath of September 11. Firefighters and volunteers who slept in the pews spoke of being comforted by presences unseen. Exhausted men would wake to feel hands resting gently on their shoulders, warm despite the cold. Some swore they saw cloaked figures drifting among the rows, pausing at each sleeping body as though in benediction. Others heard voices singing hymns in harmony, soft, mournful, yet uplifting. Though no choir was present, the most chilling accounts came from those who felt a hand clasp theirs in the night, a grip firm and steady, only to find no one beside them. Psychics and sensitives who have visited St. Paul's describe it not as a typical haunting but as a nexus. The chapel, they insist, is a crossing point, a seam in the veil between worlds. Some describe it as a beacon drawing spirits who are lost, others as a reservoir of human energy so charged it naturally thins the boundary. To sit in the nave is to feel 1,000 eyes upon you, not in malice but in hunger, the hunger of the unseen to be acknowledged. And then there are the darker presences, for not all who wander here are gentle guardians. A handful of accounts tell of shadows that loom too tall, too misshapen to belong to the once living. These shapes flicker against the walls but do not align with the light, bending in impossible angles, crawling across surfaces as though independent of space. One caretaker swore he saw a figure without a face rise from the balcony, its head bowed, its form dissolving into mist the moment he screamed. Another recounted the sound of boots pacing the length of the chapel at night, heavy and deliberate, yet when he followed the sound, the air itself grew colder until his breath turned to frost. Most harrowing is the tale of the organ. For years it has stood silent, its keys untouched, its pipes untested. Yet there are nights when faint chords drift from it, notes too soft to be deliberate, yet too structured to be coincidence. They come like fragments of hymns, broken echoes that weave through the silence. Witnesses describe the sound as mournful, as though the organ itself remembers its music and seeks to speak again, though no living hands guide it. Some say the organ plays not for the living, but for the congregation of shadows who gather when midnight deepens. The chapel's hauntings grow not from violence alone, but from endurance. Each century has layered it with more weight, more memory, more presences. The revolution charged it with the energy of founding fathers and patriots. Epidemics filled it with the keening of mothers and the whispers of the dying. Fires left it standing while others perished, creating an aura of protection that drew spirits like moths. And 9/11s carved into it the prayers of thousands and the despair of a city. Each trauma infused it further, until the very air became saturated with ghostly resonance. There is a theory whispered among occult scholars that places of great survival attract guardians bound to protect what the world has not destroyed. If this is true, then St. Paul's is a fortress not of stone, but of its survival through centuries of fire and collapse may not be miracle alone, but the work of those who linger unseen, those who have vowed never to let the chapel fall. Yet guardianship has a price. To dwell endlessly in the world of the living is to grow restless, to thirst for acknowledgement, to intrude upon the senses of mortals who cross the threshold. Thus, the chapel hums with energy, both protective and unnerving. The living who enter are not harmed, but neither are they left untouched. They leave with heaviness in their hearts, with dreams haunted by candlelight and whispers, with the faint impression of fingers grazing their skin. The haunting of St. Paul's is not a scream in the dark, but a breath upon the neck. It is not a terror that drives you away, but a presence that draws you in, compels you to listen, to witness, to feel. And once you have felt it, it lingers, like the toll of a bell that continues to vibrate long after the strike. The chapel leaves its mark. Part 2 closes not with an answer, but with the certainty of escalation. For the presences within St. Paul's do not merely wish to be observed. They yearn to speak, to reveal, to command attention. The true haunting is not the flicker of shadows or the chime of phantom bells. It is the slow realization that the chapel is alive, breathing, hungering, and that those who enter may find themselves drawn deeper into communion with the restless dead. There are nights when the veil does not thin gradually, but tears all at once. At St. Paul's Chapel, these nights are remembered not in words but in silence, because those who have lived through them find their voices falter when they attempt to tell the tale. It begins innocently, as it always does, with the whisper of wind through branches, the tilt of moonlight across gravestones, the creak of timbers shifting with age. But then, something else takes root. The chapel inhales. The air thickens like smoke. The living heart trembles with an ancient instinct, the kind that knows when it is no longer alone. And in that instant, the ordinary dissolves, and the chapel reveals its truest face. It was one such night when a caretaker named Elias, tasked with locking the chapel long after midnight, found himself unable to leave. He had worked at St. Paul's for years, sweeping aisles, polishing pews, guiding curious tourists by day. The chapel was his second home, and though he respected its strange currents of silence, he had never felt fear. But this night was different. The moment he closed the heavy oak door behind him, a sound stirred that should not have been, the toll of a bell. The bell tower had been silent for months, yet the notes came one by one, slow and deliberate, echoing through the nave as though announcing an unseen congregation. Elias froze, keys clutched tight in his hand, every hair on his arm rising. The bells tolled 9 times, then ceased, and in the echoing quiet that followed, he heard footsteps pacing above the balcony. At first, he thought it was a trespasser, perhaps a vagrant who had slipped inside. But as he climbed the narrow staircase to investigate, he realized the air grew colder with each step, until his breath fogged before him. On the balcony, there was no one, only pews wrapped in shadow. Yet the footsteps continued, moving just ahead of him, circling the length of the gallery in a steady rhythm. Then came the voice, low, resonant, chanting words Elias did not understand, as though a prayer in a language too old for memory. He turned toward the sound and saw it, a figure cloaked in black, face hidden, standing at the far end of the balcony. The figure raised its hand, and Elias felt his body seize, his breath locked in his chest. And then the chapel itself answered. The organ, long silent, exhaled, a chord deep, thunderous, vibrating through the timbers. The cloaked figure dissolved into mist, and Elias collapsed to his knees, shaking, whispering a prayer that was half plea, half surrender. He left the chapel that night, but never spoke of it without trembling, for he knew what he had seen was not merely a ghost, but a manifestation of something older, something that used the chapel as a vessel. Elias's experience is not singular. Again and again, witnesses describe the moment when the haunting ceases to be subtle and becomes overwhelming, when the chapel's presence swells into a crescendo. Some describe seeing the pews filled with translucent figures, men and women in clothing of centuries past, bowing their heads in silent worship. Others have seen the child ghost kneeling at the altar, her face turned upward in eternal supplication, her form glowing faintly in candlelight that burns without flame. The most chilling accounts are of the choir, a host of spectral voices rising in harmony, singing hymns that reverberate through the walls, though no lips move in the living world. One psychic described it as entering a dream within a dream. The chapel ceases to be merely a place. It becomes a theater where past and present converge, time folds, and the living stand shoulder to shoulder with the dead. The psychic swore that in one vision, she stood in the pews alongside soldiers in tattered revolutionary uniforms, mothers cradling infants, firemen in asher-streaked coats, from 2001, all gathered in unison, gazing at the altar as though awaiting revelation. The weight of their collective presence was unbearable, she said, pressing against her mind until she wept. It is in these moments of climax that the chapel seems to reveal its true identity, not simply a church, but a crucible of memory, a sanctuary for every soul that ever touched it. The living who entered during such nights are not witnesses, but participants. Their hearts race not with fear alone, but with awe, as though they have been drawn into a ceremony that defies death. And yet, not all presences are benevolent. There are darker currents that swirl beneath the harmony. Witnesses speak of shadows that linger at the edges of these spectral congregations, watching but never joining. These figures are taller, faceless, distorted as though shaped not by human memory, but by something older, something inhuman. They move without rhythm, gliding in unnatural angles, and when eyes meet them, the body convulses with cold. These are not guardians. These are predators, drawn to the chapel's energy as moths to flame. Some believe they are remnants of grief too heavy to ascend, others that they are entities that feed on the living's awe and terror. Whatever they are, they do not sing, they only watch. One story tells of a tourist who slipped into the chapel after hours, hoping to experience the famed haunting for himself. He sat in Washington's pew, waiting. Hours passed in silence, until the air grew so heavy he struggled to breathe. Suddenly, the pews before him filled with shadowy forms. He watched in both horror and fascination as they bowed their heads, their outlines flickering like candlelight. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw a darker shape, approaching, taller, twisted, faceless. It leaned close until its presence suffocated him. And in that moment he felt his very thoughts slipping away. He stumbled from the chapel gasping, and though his body was unharmed, he later confessed that his dreams were never the same. For weeks, he saw the faceless figure standing at the foot of his bed, watching. The climax of St. Paul's haunting is not simply spectacle, it is contagion. To witness it is to carry it. The chapel leaves imprints not only on wood and stone but on minds. Those who linger too long often find the chapel follows them home in whispers in the night, in flickering shadows across their walls. In the sudden chill of unseen company, St. Paul's never sleeps, and neither, it seems, do those it touches. There is a legend whispered among the clergy who once served there, that the chapel is not haunted in fragments, but possessed in entirety, that the building itself has become a vessel for the dead, an ark where their presences are stored. The pews, the altar, the organ, the steeplage part, is infused with centuries of souls, until the structure itself is conscious, not alive as the living understand life, but aware, watching, hungering. That if this is true, then the climax of the haunting is not the appearance of ghosts, but the realization that the chapel itself is the ghost. The building breathes, the building remembers, the building binds. Its survival through fire and ruin is not miracle but intention. It refuses to die because it cannot, because within its walls, death itself has chosen to remain. And so the spiritual climax of St. Paul's is not simply the sight of shadowed congregations or the toll of phantom bells. It is the awareness that you are standing inside something eternal, something that sees you, something that will remember you long after you are gone. The climax is not an end, it is a warning. The chapel whispers, once you enter, you belong to me. The silence after the storm was not a silence at all. It was a layered, breathing stillness, heavy with what had been spoken, with what had been awakened. St. Paul's Chapel had returned to its quiet form, yet it no longer felt like the sanctuary that belonged to the city. It pulsed, like a living heart, at the center of a body made of streets and skyscrapers. Its shadows remained in motion, long after the last flame was extinguished. David sat slumped in a pew near the front, his face pale and wet with sweat, his breathing shallow as though he had run a marathon through centuries. Alina knelt on the worn wooden floorboards, her hands trembling as they gripped the rosary that now felt strangely heavier, as though infused with centuries of whispered prayers. Father Mallory leaned against the pulpit, his body weakened, his voice gone hoarse, but his eyes burned with a strange radiance, as if he had seen a truth too immense to describe. For a moment, it seemed as though the storm of spirits had passed. The church breathed in the dark, its rafters settling, the bell above groaning slightly in the night wind. Outside, the city never slept. A taxi honked, a siren wailed somewhere distant. Life, as always, pressed forward. But within the chapel, another truth lingered, one that would never allow any of them to walk out the same. Alina was the first to speak, her voice soft and disbelieving. Did we finish it? Did we send them back? Father Mallory shook his head. He did not smile, nor did he frown. His lips simply parted with a whisper. Spirits are not sent away. They are given doorways, and we have opened more than one tonight. The words hung in the air, heavy, undeniable. David lifted his head, eyes wide. You mean, we didn't close anything? The priest's silence was answer enough. The great doors at the chapel's entrance creaked faintly, though no hand touched them. A draught whispered through the aisles, carrying with it the faintest sound to him. Fragile, incomplete, the ghost of a melody sung by voices long dead. It did not come from the organ, nor from any instrument. It rose from the walls themselves, from the marrow of the chapel, as if the building remembered every note ever sung inside it. Alina shuddered. They're still here. Father Mallory closed his eyes. Yes, they are here. They will always be here. That was never in question. The only question is, what do they want now? The air shifted. The flickering candlelight at the altar bent, as though something unseen moved past. The hymn faded into silence, replaced by a whisper that none of them could quite decipher. It was not English, not Latin, not any tongue that belonged to the waking world, and yet each of them understood it in their bones. It was a call, a reminder, a warning. David staggered to his feet, his fear mixing with frustration. Why us? Why here? Why can't they stay buried in the past? Haven't we suffered enough? The question echoed through the nave, unanswered. Then, slowly, the shadows along the far wall deepened, drawing together into the outline of a figure. It was neither man nor woman, neither whole nor broken. It was the echo of countless presences, fused into one. A face flickered within the darkness, then another, and another, shifting, overlapping, like 1,000 lost identities trying to surface at once. Alina gasped. David froze. Father Mallory lowered his gaze, whispering an ancient prayer. The figure did not advance. It simply stood, watching, or perhaps waiting. Time became unmoored inside the chapel. Minutes stretched like hours. Hours collapsed into heartbeats. The world outside moved on. Taxis speeding past Broadway, lovers arguing on sidewalks, businessmen chasing deadlines. But within St. Paul's, time was no longer linear. It curled in on itself, folding centuries into moments. David felt as though he was standing not in 21st century Manhattan, but simultaneously in 1776, in 1832, in 2001, all at once. Every candle ever lit in the chapel seemed to flicker again, superimposed upon the present. Every footstep ever taken echoed beneath his own. And the ghosts so. The ghosts did not remain quiet. They moved in the corners of vision, brushing shoulders, leaning close to whisper things that could not be remembered. They sang in wordless tones, sometimes mournful, sometimes jubilant. At times, they wept, their cries overlapping like a choir of grief. At other times, their laughter sounded far more terrifying, because it belonged not to comfort, but to madness. Alina covered her ears, tears streaming down her face. I can't hold it all. It's too much. Father Mallory's voice cut through the storm of sound, firm despite his exhaustion. You must, because this is not about ending the voices, it is about listening, about bearing witness. That is why we were chosen. David shook his head violently. Chosen? No, I didn't ask for this. I didn't want any of this. I just wanted, his words broke. I just wanted to live my life. The shadowed figure shifted, as if in response. Its overlapping faces turned toward him, some smiling, some frowning, all unreadable. Then, in a chorus of whispers, it spoke a single phrase. No one lives alone. The words hit David like a blow. His knees buckled, and he sank back into the pew. The truth of it was unbearable, because it meant that every step, every breath, every dream, was tied not only to the living, but to the dead who lingered, unseen, shaping the currents of existence. The night dragged on, and yet morning never seemed to come. Hours passed, or perhaps moments. The city's noise dimmed, muffled, as though St. Paul's had pulled itself out of Manhattan and into some other dimension entirely. The chapel became an island, floating between worlds. Father Mallory guided Alina and David toward the altar, his voice steady but his hands trembling. There is something you must see. He reached beneath the altar cloth and drew out a book, bound in cracked leather, older than the chapel itself. Its pages were filled with names lists upon lists of names, some written in elegant script, others scrawled hastily, as though written in desperation. The priest opened to the final page, and the two gasped. There, written as if in fresh ink, were their own names. David, Alina, Mallory. The letters glistened faintly in the candlelight, as though alive. David recoiled. No, that's not possible. That Father Mallory closed the book sharply, his face grave. It means what you think it means. We are not merely visitors here. We are part of it now. The chapel has claimed us. Alina clutched her rosary tighter, her knuckles white. Then what happens when we die? The priest's eyes softened, filled with sorrow. We do not leave. We remain, just as they remain. The realization settled like frost in their veins. Death was no longer an escape. Life was no longer singular. They were bound to the place that had become a living memory, a vessel for eternity. As dawn threatened, pale light seeping faintly at the stained glass windows, the three of them sat in silence. None spoke of leaving, none dared to touch the doors. The world outside might have woken, but for them, time would never be the same. And then the bell rang. Once, deep, hollow, a sound not rung by any hand, The shadows shifted. The hymn rose again, sung by voices both near and impossibly far, and the whisper returned, threading through the song. Its message unmistakable now. This is the church that never sleeps. Alina turned, her lips trembling. It means it will never let go. David's eyes filled with tears. Then, we're already ghosts. Father Mallory looked to the altar, his voice barely audible. We are. The light through the windows brightened, but it brought no comfort. The chapel did not release them. It never would. And so the story ends, not with escape, not with triumph, but with the slow, eternal recognition that some doors, once opened, can never again be shut. St. Paul's Chapel still stands. Tourists still wander in by day, marveling at its history, its survival. They sit in pews where unseen eyes watch. They take photographs where shadows lean close. They hear the faint ring of a bell when no hand has touched it. And always, in the still hours between midnight and dawn, when the city dozes for a moment in its restless cycle, the voices rise again. The church breathes, the ghosts stir, and somewhere inside, 3 more names echo among the endless choir, woven forever into the hymn of the church that never sleeps.